Volume 5 C20. Naya stood soldier-like in her place. The crossbar where her wrists were secured had a dual purpose. It kept the witness, the accused as it were, confined. But it also allowed those in terror of their lives to hold on to something to keep them on their feet. It was not lost on them that Naya did not grab the bar, rather she stared up at the judge, the vice commander with his swarthy, rough sort of face, rounded a little with age but still leathery in a way that befitted men who lived their lives at war or readying for one. He gave her no look of pity, but when he looked at her, he looked longer than he needed to before banging the gavel. A young officer approached the open space, standing in the center between jury, judge, accused, and all those watching. He spoke with the clarity of voice common among those born to lead. Humanity lives on the brink of death. The strength which holds humanity from falling into that black precipice has always been that we stand together against those who would destroy us. Demi-humans, beastmen, dragons, and monsters. These are our natural enemies. To render aid or comfort to any of these is to commit treason. The defendant has been known to commit this offense in the past to demi-humans, and now to have repeated the same sin during her corrective assignment. She refuses to learn from her mistake, and as a result she placed the entire kingdom at risk of a dragon attack. Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that there can be only one verdict for this crime, not only because the defendant is guilty. He made a dramatic pause and held an accusing finger stretched out toward Naya, but also because the penalty of death is the only way to spare us from her deepening corruption. Naya's chains rattled a little, she turned her eyes to his, and he immediately put his back to her and walked away. I never got to meet with my advocate. How fair is that? Naya cursed her ill luck until she realized the judge was looking down at her. Well? He asked. Judge? Naya asked, glancing up at Gustav. You will be defending yourself, did nobody tell you? He asked, briefly baffled. Naya's jaw dropped for an instant before she recovered. Forgive me, but no. Nobody was willing? She asked the question and got no answer. No, nobody was allowed. She cursed. I've never been a public speaker. I wonder if anybody else has ever had to just wing things like this before? She cleared her throat to center their attention on her. She took a deep breath, gathered her thoughts, and then addressed them with an enthusiastic, even performative voice befitting a stage actor in a dramatic moment. I am accused of treason and collaboration. But to be clear, I never took pay for what I did. No orc, goblin, dragon, nothing ever paid me for what I did, or didn't do. I hunted with squads before, and alone later in the wildlands, and I took many, many demi-human lives. Even my persecutors don't deny that I have an exceptionally high success rate. Objection, the prosecutor spoke up, but looked only at the judge. We are not here because of the favorable parts of her record. Her past successes are not at issue, only her greatest failures are material to the case. Sustained. Gustav banged the gavel and turned to Naya. Please stick to the matter at hand. As you command. Naya answered with a bow of her head. The sack she wore was itchy on her skin, but she ignored the urge to scratch, and instead continued to speak. It would be useless to deny that I spared some lives. I felt pity for them. An orc mother to be who clutched her belly and begged me not to shoot her, that she only came looking for food and didn't hurt any of my people. A wounded stone-spitter child whose father died by my hand. All he wanted was to live and desperately tried to protect a corpse. A snake woman and her mate fleeing wounded from a monster that wiped out their tribe, with nothing in their arms but the eggs they could save, not even weapons to fight us with. Yes, I spared lives. But not without reason. And the dragon? The judge asked pointedly. He was weak, helpless in sight of my bow. Yes, I spared him. I tended his wounds to nurse him back to health. Naya answered, and a rumbling went up around her. And don't you think you should have killed it? The prosecutor asked. No, he was weak. I'm a paladin. Protecting the weak is supposed to be common sense for us, isn't it? Naya demanded of the whole courtyard, the whole fortress. What's the point of protecting humanity just to make us into monsters ourselves? I didn't do any of this for coins. I did it because I got to sleep at night. I did what I thought was right. How can I apologize for that? She asked in a small, quiet voice that still somehow echoed off the far walls where soldiers stood in quiet observation. At the judge's urging, Naya told the story of her hunts, and began the story of her tending to Olisard Ark with setting down her bow when he asked for his life. She spoke of him with affection that struck the fortress as beyond bizarre, and yet she never flagged or even noticed that they found it odd. What she also did not notice was the intensity of focus that came her way from Albedo. Lord Touch Me spoke like that. How could she have come by the words of a supreme being? That troubled the Guardian Overseer. And that is what happened, Naya said when she finally finished recounting the events in question. I only ever did what I thought was right. She added again, how are we supposed to have a kingdom of justice if we slaughter others for daring to exist? She demanded to know, but silence answered her. And then, she shouted, bellowed, even roared out in defiance of their silent judging eyes, they're people too. They're people too. They're people too. They're people too. The echo of her self-condemning words rang off every wall and filled every ear. Gustav was looking down at her as if she'd grown a second head. He didn't even bang the gavel. Not far away, Remedios stood with arms crossed, smug and satisfied. That will get rid of one more threat to humanity. Naya, for her part, was barely minding the chaos that grew up around her words. Humans sparing wounded or young demi-humans was not unknown, but it was an open secret that was never publicly, let alone proudly proclaimed. When the judge came to his senses and began to bang the gavel, the prosecutor approached. Though he could no longer meet Naya's eyes, he was able to speak with force and asked, and how would you have made amends if the dragon had responded to your kindness by rampaging over the Roble Holy Kingdom? Olisar Dark would not have done that. Naya bit back. We were friends. Yes, such good friends that he left you here. The prosecutor mocked her, then turned his face up to the judge. Your Honor, enough has been presented. The accused convicts herself by her own words. Had you all not screwed everything up, we might have had a powerful ally here to protect us, to help us. Naya shot back without waiting for permission to speak. Imagine how we could thrive if we had a dragon to help ward the border in the wildlands. Now, you put us in danger. Not me. Naya spat the words like they were frozen venom meant to chill the blood before death took hold. But Gustav again pounded the gavel. The jury may deliberate until morning. Court is now out of session. Unless the accused would like to plead for mercy from the court. It was almost a plea of its own, a lifeline, tossed to the drowning in dark waters. Naya heard it. Naya saw it. Naya swam away from it, kicking it back in her wake. I will not apologize. Olisar Dark was weak, so were the rest I spared. I am a paladin, I protect this country, I fight for this country. How dare anyone tell me I'm wrong for applying our stated ideals to all, no matter their race. I said it before, I say it again now. They are all people too. Do what you're going to do, but I will never say I'm sorry. Naya shot back at the judge, and Gustav could only shake his head with pity. Return the prisoner to her cell until the verdict. The judge said with a heavy spirit, and once again she walked with sharp metal points ringing her throat and a sword at her back all the way back to her cell. She entered, then turned around to see the halberds poking through the bars in case she attempted anything. Remedios held the door and looked at her with contempt, then slammed it shut with a growl of disgust. No more food or water for you tonight, she said while locking Naya in the cage-like structure. There's no sense in wasting it. You're a petty one, but have it your way, Naya said and went to lie down on the straw. She interlocked her fingers and lay on her back with her head in the palms to look up at the ceiling. Get out, I'm not going anywhere, Naya spat at them, and the heavily armored paladins flinched enough that the clink of their armor reached Naya's ears. Remedios said nothing, she only stared, and stared, and stared as she was ignored. Until Naya's stomach growled 3 hours later. Only then did Remedios make a noise. She laughed. She laughed, and left Naya alone. Volume 5 C21. Ileana was drinking a thick dark beer, compliments of her generous lady Albedo as a reward for her hard work, and while most of the time her lady said little more than orders, this was an exception. A practical exception wherein Albedo grilled and teased every detail of the use of alcohol in seduction. They were alone in a tent and chanted for silence, but it only prevented sound from getting out and not coming in. Which meant that the wild lustful cries of the green-eyed prostitute the next tent over carried through easily, a kind of musical accompaniment to Ileana's explanation. Use too much, and you can ruin the experience, but a little bit, it makes men bold, especially if they are naturally shy. Ileana explained, and Albedo formed a little frown. Does it have a higher effect on the shy then? That makes no sense, Albedo said, and her displeasure did not vanish when Ileana shook her head, bouncing her golden hair around. No, Lady Albedo, it provides the shy with something they desperately need. She leaned forward, and Albedo reflexively did the same despite having hearing good enough to have heard a butterfly whisper to her. She took a sip of the dark bitter beer and whispered, "It provides them an excuse. I've seen many human women present themselves as demure, despite being as full of lust as." Ileana jerked her thumb toward the side of the tent bordering the hawse just as the green-eyed one let out a cry of orgasmic bliss. "That one." She snorted. "Men, human men, try to present themselves as bold and powerful, pursuers, hunters, but many, or maybe most, are not. They need a little liquid courage." She took another deep draught, gulping down half the pint and then put a hand on Albedo's thigh. "You're so beautiful. I want you so much it hurts. I know it's wrong, but I don't care." The elf leaned forward to kiss the guardian overseer, and then stopped. The disguised blue eyes of Albedo returned to their vertical slit yellow. The elf reseated herself and before the guardian could even properly process her outrage at the bold maneuver, "Forgive me, Lady Albedo. This beer seems to have gotten the best of me, it's very strong." It clicked for her. Albedo understood. "I see. So they fear rejection, and this lets them pretend that their failed effort was not their fault, but that of the alcohol." Ileana's worldly eyes beheld the besotted woman whose disguise returned her irises to the false blue. "Yes, my lady. And it lets them act in such a way that they won't ruin what they have with someone they care about if it goes poorly. That, of course, can hurt too. I loathe humans, but some of those who perform in my line of work have pursued lives as mistresses to wealthy patrons. They play at love, hidden away with any of their paramours' children. Play though, sometimes gets far too real. My lady, from what you say, the man you love cares for you in a very specific way. It will not be easy to change it. But you will help me," Albedo added. Ileana didn't care if it was a request or a command. She nodded. "I will put forth my utmost for my avenger." She glanced toward the tent entrance. "If more humans thought of my race like the one they're trying, maybe things would be better. It makes me wonder what would have happened if she'd come to Wenmark." She snorted with derision. "Probably nothing. What could one squire of the Paladin Order do?" Neither of them really noticed that the loud whore had stopped being loud and brashly opened their tent as if it were her own. "Hey, prude girl, elf girl." She held the tent flap high overhead. The moonlight at her back glinted off the sheen of her auburn hair. "I'm sorry to bother you two lovebirds. I know you're closed and all, but I could really use a drink. I'm drained." She smacked her lips. So is she, but still. She let out a ribald, even vulgar laugh. Ever quick on the opportunity, Albedo played her all to the hilt. "It will cost you 3 times the usual price for after hours. Also, it isn't prude girl, I'm just selective." She crossed her arms and narrowed her eyes. "My name is Albedo, and you will remember it." The icy voice stabbed deep and the green-eyed horse stiffened. "Right. Just teasing a little, it's all in good fun you know." Ileana worked with quiet diligence, putting a mug under the tap and pressing the lever to fill a large wooden mug while Skarna fumbled with several silver coins to lay down without getting too close to the icy-eyed Albedo. "So, that was something today, huh? Do you think they'll kill her?" Skarna asked with the casual indifference of the uninvested. "Do you care?" Ileana asked when Albedo remained silent. For a few seconds only the slow trickle of beer made noise in the tent. "No, I don't know her, so I can't get that interested. I'm a peasant from a little village. I've never seen a demi-human, or even an elf. Honestly, this is as far as I ever go from home, so it's really hard to care what happens to one pissed-off minor noble in a backwater. I guess she's brave enough, but what good is that in the end? She's probably going to die." Skarna shrugged. "It's better to enjoy life as much as possible for as long as possible, let the rest of the world go its own way." She accepted the mug from Ileana, but looked uncomfortable with the vicious stare. "What?" Skarna asked. "You get to do that, people in my position don't. Or didn't." Ileana answered, "Nobody ever asked me. If I stayed there, nobody ever would." Skarna looked briefly shamefaced, her vibrant green eyes briefly looked away. "Sorry. Why are you so certain she'll die?" Albedo asked, redirecting the moment, her eyebrow raised in brief curiosity. I've slept with half the men and women on the jury, and men aren't the only ones who don't know what their tongues are for. She scratched her back and arched with an almost brazen advertisement of her scantily clad flesh. Anyway, their purses are a bit heavier than when they first got here, and they've still got all their stuff, minus a few ounces that they'll boast of as buckets, so unless they're secretly playing whores too. What did they sell? Skarna let the words hang and gave a shrug as if it were obvious. Albedo thought that won over. Several of those are having affairs with doppelganger agents. Their spending is deep, but I didn't arrange for this, so who did? Albedo wondered, and immediately ruled out the judge. He seemed sympathetic. There weren't many other options, but one was immediately obvious. Whore, Albedo said and pointed to the prostitute who held the pint up high with her head tilted back. She gulped it as loud as she did quickly, draining it to the last drop before holding it out. Another. Also, Skarna, she said, correcting Albedo, and then drew out 5 more silver coins which she laid down on the crate in between each other, then handed back the mug. She wiped her mouth with the back of her arm and smacked her lips. Damn, that's Nazarick Kingdom stuff. I might have to pay that place a visit one day. Ileana took the mug and began to fill it again. I'll give you all the beer we've got left when it's time to go, and this cart, on the condition that you don't leave until we're ready, Albedo said, ignoring the correction while the prostitute tilted the mug back and began to chug it again with loud, steady gulps. Skarna wiped her mouth again, but rather than ask for another, she asked with narrow eyes, why? I'd just like you to tell your story after the victim is executed, that's all. Albedo replied. Skarna shook her head, then stamped her foot on the hoe leaning nearby. The wooden handle shot toward her face only to be caught in her hand. She twirled it around in a blur of motion as if it were a weapon. The dark hair and blonde hair of Albedo and Ileana billowed lightly in the false breeze. No thanks, lady. I look pretty impressive with wooden swords and things like that, but it's all just dancing. I'm not really a fighter. If some pissed off nobles get exposed, I'll be lucky if I just sit in a dungeon for the rest of my life. Then what fun can I have? She shook her head with vigor and then slapped the farm implement seamlessly back into the place she'd picked it up from, killing the breeze her whirlwind of motion created. Just think about it. We can't possibly sell all these things, and think how long this much beer would last you, and you could sell your other tools to your neighbors. Who knows what you could do with all that money? They really aren't very likely to find you. Albedo pointed out, and she watched the temptation fill Skarna's eyes. You'll get my answer by whether I'm here or not, Skarna said, but licked her lips and eyed the barrel where Ileana stood. But one more sure would show me you're serious. She shook the mug a few times and handed it over to Ileana. The elf filled it up and handed it back to a hand that remained outstretched, fingers twitching with anticipation. Skarna downed the mug and slapped it down on the crate. Thanks for the beer, elf girl, prude girl, I owe you one. Volume 5 C22. Nia lay on her bed of straw until she fell asleep. She was lying on her bed of straw after she awoke and the sun began to rise. She remained lying on her bed of straw as the minutes passed and became hours. Still nobody returned for her, nobody gave her food, nobody gave her water. Her parents didn't come for her, and that was somewhat unfortunate at least. I would have liked to see them again, but we said everything that should have been said. Slitting my throat to spare me pain will be the last act of kindness they can give. Nia lay back and covered her eyes with her forearm, blocking out all light from the already dim cell that got too little light. Outside, she could hear a great deal of noise and shouting, but she couldn't say what it was. Not really. The noise buried itself under more noise, and it was hours more at least before she saw a dusty Remedios Custodio return. It's time, traitor, the brown-haired woman said with a look of the utmost contempt, her head tilted back, her eyes cast down, her steady gaze offering no hint of human warmth or empathy. Nia rolled over on her side and stood up while Remedios fumbled with a set of iron keys. So, now I know what evil looks like. I won't forget it when I move on to the next world. She folded her hands behind her back and stood with her feet shoulder-width apart. Evil? No. I'm good. You let the enemies of humanity live. How can you be anything but evil yourself? Remedios asked with icy hate. Nia's steady, unbroken gaze didn't waver, and for the first time in all her life, the young archer put every fiber of her vindictive anger into that stare, and savored the moment the paladin commander shuddered. The door slid open with so much force that it ripped away from its moorings and cracked against the stone wall before falling to the floor with a clatter. "At least you can't garnish my wages for this, bitch." Naya laughed at the red-faced and flustered Remedios and began walking toward the door. The ditzy idiot kept her sword at Naya's back, but it was unnecessary. The squire of the Paladin Order walked as if she were out for a stroll after services at the temples. The open areas were populated, and the heavily armored Paladin Order guards fell in around her the same as before. She watched the world around her with great indifference. Instead, each step seemed to be a trip back through time itself, from her first steps and the embrace of a mother and father that she now knew loved her beyond any doubt, up to the final moments. Each moment of her life seemed to be relived, the good and bad alike. The drums of the soldiers that picked up to mark her steps until the securing of her wrists at the stand as had been done before, only added to the moment. Vice Commander Gustave Montagna pounded his gavel, and glanced down at the little squire. "Before you hear the verdict, do you have any words for the court of this nation?" "I have words, if I may, though they're not for the court." Naya made the request as a polite statement, and Gustave inclined his head toward her. "Proceed," he replied. "Mom, Dad, maybe you weren't perfect parents, but you raised me to do my best, and that's all I tried to do. I did what was right as I knew it. I protected the weak, no matter what they were. I put my life down for the first friend I ever made, and what a friend he was. That's what it means to love the ones you love. So I'm not sorry for what I did, I never will be, for what little time that means for me now. But I am sorry to leave you this way," Naya said, and watched the court writer copy down her final words. The vice commander looked at her as if she'd gone mad. "Did someone tell you the verdict?" Naya laughed in his face. She looked up at him, threw back her head, and laughed like a barking mad fool who made a fart joke. "This is the Roble Holy Kingdom. Guilt was a foregone conclusion." Naya spat in the dust. It rankled and a few rumbles went up where she could be heard, and she was heard as far away as there were ears to hear her. "Ask the verdict?" Gustave flushed red in competition with Remedios, but whatever retort he had in mind, he buried while the noble in charge of the jury stood up. "On the charge of treason, we find the defendant, Naya Baraha, guilty. On the charges of collaboration, we find the defendant guilty." The noble sat down to silence. The vice commander looked at them as if they'd gone mad. His eyes swept every juror. No evidence that she took money or treasure from anyone, or offered any information or took anything for her aid, was ever presented. How did they find her guilty of collaboration? He stiffened while the smug-looking lot of nobles and soldiers played with the contents of their pockets or purses, little nervous gestures as if they expected him to question their verdict openly. A dreadful suspicion came over him. He felt the eyes of the squire questioningly looking up at him. It was as if she was saying, "See, what did I tell you?" It was a punch to the gut, and with the knowing smile of his commander staring back at him from behind the defendant, a leap of intuition that one day earlier would have been broader than a great wide canyon shrunk to the distance of a single step. "You didn't," he thought with horror. The gavel in his hand took on the weight of a castle. His fingers around the wooden handle felt as if they were on fire. His soul commanded of him to drop it, let go. Call this into question. Call for an investigation. But who will the queen set to investigate? The one behind it. It was raw frustration and bitterness that gave him the strength to just carry on, but the pity he saw for him in the evil eyes of the woman whose life hung in his hands, he knew without a doubt, that will haunt me to the day I die. He raised his gavel up and slammed it down. The defendant is sentenced to the penalty of the stake and the blades, to be carried out at sunset in 1 hour on the wall. Poor fool. Naya thought with a generosity of spirit that caught even herself by surprise. I was condemned the moment people took a look at me. I was twice as condemned when I explained myself, and 3 times as condemned when I had the misfortune to have Remedios Custodio as a superior. But my suffering will end soon. His though? His is just beginning. The crowd was sullen, no cheers, no cries of triumph, no vindictive calls, just sullenness and silent acceptance. The stake was erected while Naya watched from far down below. The view would let her see far out over into the lands of the demi-humans. I wonder what it's like out there? It must be a difficult place to get by, all of them constantly at odds with one another. The survivors I spoke with always talked of vicious wars. I wonder. Naya barely noticed when she was unlocked and made to walk under the eyes of the fortress toward the stairs. Are any of the ones I spared still alive? Did I make any difference to anyone at all? That answer's absence left her wanting, but she was oddly comforted by knowing it would not be a mystery for long. The bell tolled to call any absent to come and watch the traitor's death. The stake was twice Naya's height, and thicker around than her waist with space to spare. Remedios's sword at her back threatened evisceration, and while walking along the wall Naya saw a young boy far down below running with a series of rusty old blades bundled under his arm. Even from where she was, Naya could see the red stains on the old and uncared-for metal. Behind Remedios came 6 heavily armored paladins, their halberds at her throat, their faces hidden by their heavy helmets, their metal-covered bodies gleaming in the slow declining light of the sun. They would have been more impressive if they didn't flinch whenever she looked at them. Her wrist manacles were undone, Remedios's sword tip pressed tighter to her body. From somewhere down below, wails reached her ears. "Mom, Dad. I told you that you shouldn't come watch this." Naya felt a welling of sorrow in her breast as her arms were yanked sharply back and secured again at the wrists behind the wooden post. She glanced up at Remedios. "Can I ask something from you?" Naya said with gentle calm. The commander of the Paladin Order stood in front of her and looked down at Naya with suspicion in her idiotic eyes. "What, traitor? When you run the rusty swords into me, make it quick, pin me by the heart," Naya asked. The wails were growing louder, closer. "Are you afraid?" Remedios sneered. Naya shook her head. "No. My parents are down there, I don't want them to hear." Remedios was briefly taken aback by this, even taking a step away from her and looking at her with fresh eyes before she shook her head again. "You're afraid of pain. But it won't do you any good, you're going to scream." "Oh, I'm sure I will scream. Everybody screams when you stab them in the guts. But I won't be afraid. I just don't want them to suffer because of my choices. Please. I'll be dead either way, just give me this for my years of service," Naya pled. Remedios seemed to think it over until a young page boy huffed and puffed his way over to her and held out the first rusty blade. The wails of her parents became shouts of anger. From down below, Naya could hear the sound of fighting. She held the sword aloft, a single saber, a sharp tip still in place, but the rest ugly, almost ruined, and gave a wordless answer to Naya's plea. She drew it back and then thrust it forward into Naya's guts. Naya let loose a blood-curdling scream that echoed out over the demi-human lands. In the distance she could see a dot appear. The demi-human lands were beautiful, stark and with many hills that seemed to stretch far beyond the horizon. The sword in her guts pinned her to the stake. Her vision blurred, but she saw Remedios take another blade from the page, a young boy whose face became white as a sheet while he watched the commander work. This one was a short sword, thick, vicious, and rusty as could be. Remedios thrust it home close to the other, and Naya's howls of agony threatened to cross the world. "Let her go, you bastards!" Naya heard her father bellow. His violent eyes, the harbinger of her own, was enough to put fear into those who barred his way, and she heard the sound of her mother's sword coming out. Naya's screams could not be formed into words. "Go back. Get away. You can't help me now." She wanted to scream, but her screams became burbles of blood that ran down her face and dripped over the pathetic excuse for clothing to drip down to her bare feet and pool around her toes on the grey stone of the wall. She tried to look back, she tried to focus, she tried to struggle, but only felt the edges of the blades tear into her organs further. She recalled having heard that before, of people using their impalement to open up new wounds to die faster and end their suffering. However, all she wanted to do was warn her parents to stop. All, that was, until the distant dot became obvious. Naya began to do the unexpected then. She straightened up as best she could, and began to laugh. "Ola Dark, you son of a bitch," she garbled out through the blood of her wounds as he loomed larger and larger. Others began to see. She felt the change in the air. A dragon in flight was graceful, beautiful, and terrifying. His lashing blue tail, his leather wings, his massive maw and imposing body. A roar split the air and stilled all thoughts of violence. Whatever Remedios might have been, Naya never once thought the woman a coward, but the page boy ran immediately. The soldiers guarding her ran next, dropping their halberds and sprinting for the steps, several falling off the edge and dropping down screaming to their deaths. But Remedios did not run. She snarled, drew her holy sword, and as the dragon came close, she let out a battle cry. For the Holy Queen and for our kingdom, she bellowed out. The swiping of the dragon's claws as he slammed home left her no further time to scream her defiance or even strike as she was sent flying far, far away. For a moment Nia had a brief memory come to mind of the night she saw Overlord come crashing down to the ground. She saw his mouth coming down, the stones of the wall smashed like grains of sand struck by a towering ocean wave, and his terrible maw closed around her. Eaten instead? I didn't see that coming. His breath. It's very cool, she thought as she unwittingly offered her blood to his tongue. She lost sight of all else then, and all she could do was wait for whatever would come next. Volume 5 C23. Even I didn't see that coming, Albedo muttered under her breath as the broken meat that was once Remedios Custodio went sailing away from the wall. The dragon seemingly ate the prisoner, and then left as if he was only there for a quick bite to eat. The stones of humanity's defenders crumbled with ease that would have made her laugh had she not been maintaining her cover. Ileana, she saw out of the corner of her eye, looked with wonder and awe as the titan-like strength of her human oppressors, once so impressive to her, crumbled like a little sandcastle kicked at by a child. Out of the corner of her other eye, she saw the Hors get away from their tents. A great many were frozen in fear, but those who ran away showed very good instincts as blocks of stone came crashing down, turning some unfortunates into red stains in the dirt. Arrows flew from bows before the dragon had gone even 20 meters from the wall, but their aim was between hasty and bad, earning a mix of praise and contempt from the guardian overseer. Adept effort, but poor execution, she thought as people around her scattered. As a test, her own passive area of effect resistance seemed to translate to a curious kind of luck wherein stones that should have headed toward her instead seemed to land away from her instead. The new world is really a very interesting place. She kept a bemused smile on her face that didn't vanish when Ileana took cover behind her, crouching down at Albedo's back and covering her golden hair with her hands. The whole of the event took a mere minute or two, and then it was over, and Albedo's mind began to race with the possibilities, and how much faster this would mean her master would come to join her. Overlord did his best not to do any harm to the squire in his mouth, and as he flapped his wings away, he tried to ignore just how good she tasted. She must have magic in the blood, he thought, and recalled her mentioning her ability to imbue mana into her arrows for some nasty effects on those she hit with it. Of course she does, he realized, and tried to speak, albeit somewhat muffled. I'm a little late, but yeah, I'll be fine. Je try not to move, he said and looked behind him. The arrows fell far short of him, and though his sharp eyes saw that they were loading ballistae, they were in no way prepared to hit the small target he was rapidly making of himself. Whether they finished loading or not, he wasn't sure, but he caught sight of no giant arrows, and so he concluded they hadn't bothered to shoot. He landed out of sight beyond a distant hill as soon as he was able, and lowering his head to the ground, he opened his mouth. The first thing Nia saw when she opened her eyes, other than the top of the inside of a dragon's mouth, was that there were several orcs rushing over and picking her up by the stake to which she was still bound. Her body was starting to feel cold. I'm dying. She knew the signs. Without a caster, she wasn't going to last long. Remedios should have pinned her with only one sword and allowed her to expire over time, but she had used 3. Worse, vital organs had been pierced and then more damage done during her rescue. She'd seen demi-humans die like this, pierced, bleeding out. Some spoke of how cold they were. Out of pity, more than once she had covered the dying with a cloak so that they would not expire shivering. A pointless gesture, but now it is my turn, she thought and looked up at the orcs that laid her down on the ground. The caster is coming. Overlord growled down at her when he raised his head up again. Nia spat out blood from her mouth and gave him a weak smile. It's enough that you came back for me. Nobody ever did that before, she said, but her body had begun to shiver. It's cold in me. I'm glad you got away. But unless you've got a potion under those scales, Nia said, and then her eyes, which had been closing, popped wide open as Overlord raised his foreleg and then put a claw to it, then sliced open his armored body. Blood as white as snow gushed out and for a moment Nia feared she might drown in it. Already cold, for a moment Nia was utterly freezing, and then, I'm not cold anymore? Am I dead? Did I die? She asked. Her eyes could see nothing, but the sense of freezing and chills were utterly gone. Then she felt something else. her strength returning. But it didn't feel like her normal strength. Everything around her was white, as if she were surrounded on all sides by glowing lights, but they were fading. Her numb limbs were getting their feeling back. She felt the swords being pulled from her body, and opened her mouth to scream into the light, but she couldn't hear the screams she was sure she was making. Naya felt utterly disembodied, a will, a mind, but no body to contain it. Only the ghost of pain and agony clawing away at her, but rapidly weakening. Then even that was gone, and the light that engulfed her began to fade. She could hear the chattering voices of others again. I don't think she will need the healer after all. She recognized Olisar Dark's voice, the sound of relief that would have been easy to overlook before. Isn't she human? An orc was speaking, an orc whose voice she knew. I spared that one. She realized, I am now where he once was, but Olisar Dark is here, so maybe not. So many questions. The rational part of Naya's brain was working again, and it was confused. She was. But I doubt her fellow humans would count her as that anymore. They're very finicky about these things, or so she has told me. Even distant elven ancestry is held in contempt. Olisar Dark remarked, her life is saved, but the life she had is now gone forever. I am afraid she will never be able to go home. As the light faded away to nothing, Naya opened her mouth to speak. Everything felt utterly sublime. What did you do? She asked and opened her arms. The bonds which held her fast snapped like toothpicks. I gave you some of my blood, Olisar Dark said in a grave, quiet voice which Naya could not pin down as far as what it felt like. I couldn't say if it would work or not, but as you have at least some magic in you, I thought it might. And it did. It didn't work quite how I expected, but it did work. Naya pursed her lips and looked down at her hands where the chains dangled uselessly. The light tan she had on the skin there was gone, her bare feet were the same. Like her body had not been kissed by sunlight before, but with a very light bluish-white hue. Her fingers felt strange too. A bizarre impulse came over her, something she could not explain, and when she focused on the tips, she saw the once normal human nails extend, curve, like vicious claws. Small, like an eagle's talons. This feels strange. Very strange, Naya whispered, and felt the breath on her hands. It was cold as a winter's chill. Your hair has changed also, it's now very white. Olisar Dark added, and Naya's hand started up to grab at loose strands and pull them a little away from her head so that she could see the strands out of the corner of her eyes. I am. What happened? Exactly what happened? Naya asked, confusion as a whirlwind in her head. She reached up to her mouth and touched her teeth. They were not all like tiny knives, but a few, very much so. I do not know the word for it, Naya Braha, but if I had to name it, I would call you a dragonid. Olisar Dark said, leaving Naya struggling to work out just what that meant for her, before the reality of it all hit home. She sat down on the stake she was meant to die pinned to. The rusty swords lay at her feet on the ground as if they had been cast down in surrender. Mum. Dad. Had there been anyone else, she would have named them in her thoughts, but there wasn't. Only them, and when she looked back, the wall and the fortress were obscured, hidden by the hill, but even out of sight, she knew the truth. I can't go to that side anymore. I'll be killed on sight, not just as a traitor, but as a demi-human? An enemy of humanity. My home. My life. My family. I just barely got the latter back, and now it's gone forever. She missed, through the tears that fell, that those orcs that gathered nearby, led by the big one she spared once before, all began to kneel.